I'm John Locke. I help run the Writing Center. Does anyone know what a lit review is? One? Okay. I won't ask you to put your definition on the line because everyone thinks they know what a lit review is, and it ends up being something a bit different than what you expect from the name. So we'll really get into what it is. And the reason this is called mastering the literature review is one, you're getting a master's degree, and master means mastering a subject matter. If you're a nonfiction writer and you're aiming for publication, you want to master the topic you're writing about, and the reader expects that. Think of yourself as a reader. If you pick up a nonfiction article, say the latest issue of Outdoor Magazine has an article on the best ski resorts in California. Would you be happy if the author went through the first three and then stopped? No, you wouldn't. You would want them to visit every single one, pull out the important themes, and capsulize it for you. So if you were writing that article, you'd start going to the ski resorts one after another. Maybe halfway through that process, you'd realize, well, I've been taking notes, but I missed some important stuff. I'm realizing something else is important here. The hot chocolate dispensers at the top of the ski runs. Didn't know about that before. Okay, got to go back to the beginning, start checking out that information, recompiling my notes, and eventually get a thorough examination of a subject and present the findings to the reader. The reader's going to be happy. And that's kind of the frame of mind you want to have when you're writing your thesis. Be really into the subject matter, be thorough, master it, and one of the key ingredients, as we'll see, is the literature review, which is not kind of a formality. It's actually very much at the core of what academic writing is. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover today. We're going to think about scale. Scale is the size of things. And then we want to look at scope. And scope is the limits of things, the boundaries. The red items will be interactive. We'll talk about the relationship of the research question to the literature review. We want to get into a definition of what the lit review is. Also, because there are a lot of misconceptions, we want to define what it's not. Types of literature review. We'll get into the master's versus the PhD. Is there anyone here who's not working on a master's? Everyone's doing a master's? Okay. It's still useful to get into the distinction, so we'll spend a little time on that. The critical nature of a lit review. We are criticizing literature, not merely summarizing it. Organization and writing, a few tips there. And then we'll look at a lit review that you should already have a copy of, and it's okay to peek ahead of time if you want. And we'll go through, and then we'll be able to apply the ideas of a lit review to a nice, short, real-world example, see how it works out, and then a little wrap-up. Okay, thinking about scale. Let's start in the middle here. This triangle indicates we're going from something small to something large. So consider a field, effects of technology on society. Do you think that would be an appropriate topic for a master's thesis? You could probably do it in 10,000 pages, right? So 6 months for the thesis, 10,000 pages, no problem. No, that's a very broad topic and it's not very well defined. Going up, where does it draw from? It might draw from sociology, technology, what are the tools we're talking about, information science, what's the analysis of how all this stuff works. Way too broad, nobody goes up to that level. This might be a book level topic if it was more narrowly focused. So going down the scale, and when we're writing a thesis, we're always looking for something narrow. Think about when you have articles assigned to you in your course readings. They're very narrowly defined, really narrow, but the author wants to be thorough and drill that topic. So here's a potential topic inside effects of technology. The efficacy of the 911 call system. How well does it work? Do you think that would be a suitable topic for a master's thesis? Too broad? I mean, how many jurisdictions are there in the country that run 911 systems? It's got to be at least 50. It's probably county-wide, city-wide, there's probably thousands of them. So a review of that subject, way too broad. How about in responding to medical emergencies? Cuts it down, still too broad? Okay, why don't we cut medical emergencies down to stroke victims? We know that the 911 system is designed to respond to problems quickly. Stroke is a problem that requires quick response. So that's an obvious value to the 911 system. Master's thesis? Maybe. Still kind of broad. Okay, so scale. Let's think about scope. All right, and all right, excuse the simplistic example, but this gets at the most common misconception of what a lit review is. So what are we looking at here? Water. You sure? Okay. You're probably right. How many objects is this? Last quarter I asked this and someone said billions if you consider every molecule a separate object. So for the point of view, for the purpose of this argument, let's call it 2. We've got the scope. This is the boundary and this is the content, right? This is what's inside and this is how far it goes. Now, this makes a very nice analogy for a literature review. Scope is what we're looking for in the lit review. We want to know what the limitations are of the literature. We want to know what the boundaries are. The content, what is in that literature, the substance of it, all the gory details, that's something we might put in the background chapter or other parts of the thesis where relevant. So we'll see how that plays out as we go along. And this is what happens if your thesis does not have a lit review. Your content just goes everywhere and it quickly dries up. Okay, relating the research question to the lit review. The question is very important. The lit review and the research question are really tightly bound. If you want to think of that opening topic, how does the 911 system work, benefit stroke victims? When we ask a question like that, what we're doing is we're creating a subfield for the purpose of the thesis. We always think of physics is in that building, English department's over there, engineering's over there. That's just a convenience so that we can specialize intelligently. When we tackle a real world problem, the real world problem doesn't care where knowledge is coming from. So when we ask a research question, we're defining a mini field, which is all the literature that will help in answering that question. Could come from anywhere and everywhere. So we want to choose that question very carefully. As we've seen from the triangle slide, if you go too broad, you're biting off more than you have time for. We often see students have really wonderful research questions, and what they're doing is they're volunteering to write a book. Well, a book takes 2 or 3 years. You only have 6 months. You want to think more like the author of an academic article does. Narrow, well-defined, something that's within reason for the time I have to do it. Second, the research question gives a boundary. You know, knowledge is infinite. It goes off in every direction. It even includes we as the writers are part of all knowledge. You need a boundary, you need a way to stop yourself from going off course. So a really sharp, well-defined research question helps you do that. When you read material, when you analyze it, you can constantly say, is this helping to answer my question? If not, move on. If so, look at that material. And that'll be true of the research question and the literature review. Okay, finally, good research questions don't spring out of our minds fully formed. They can be really hard to nail down what is a realistically worded research question. So what happens is you have an idea about one, you start to look into the material, you find out the topic is too broad, or on the other end of the scale, there's just simply nothing out there. So maybe you're shifting your question, shifting your interest. You're looking for a question that hasn't been answered, but that realistically can be answered. So you're going to change those two things as you move forward in your research. All right, so this will be an interactive element. Constructing research questions, a very important technique. We teach a workshop on that. Unfortunately, we've already done that this quarter, but it will be offered again next quarter, so keep that in mind. Let's go back to the original topic, the efficacy of the 911 system in responding to stroke victims. So that's not a question, that's just a statement of a topic. We need a question. So one of our professors, Zachary Shore, likes to say 8 words or fewer, 11 if you really must. And that means compressing that topic to a very tight focus. So how does 911 assistance aid stroke victims? Okay, 7 words, that's in the ballpark. Could I leave off the word how? Does 911 assistance aid stroke victims?
Potentially, but it could lead you to a conclusion as opposed to...
Yeah, a one-word thesis, yes, no, maybe. Good point. Yeah, so we want a question that gets at explaining things. How, why, how does the world work? All right, so thinking about this question, what's the basic factor that links the 911 system to the problem of stroke? What links the tool to the problem? What would be the key element there that you could think of?
Response time.
Time, okay. 911 is a tool that's designed to solve problems quickly. This is a problem that requires a rapid response. So these two items are kind of made to order. So let's think about scope versus content then. And I'll get us started with scope here. And I'll put in two major topic areas. Okay, 911 response times. And maybe down here, the effects of stroke. We know we want to link these two problem domains. If you were starting this on day one and you were looking for material that would help you answer this question, how does 911 help? What kind of studies would you look for? Can you think of things that would help answer that question? Okay, success rates. All right. Of anything? Just for stroke, okay. Okay, that's a good one. What would be the limitations of a study like that you might find? Regions, that's good, yeah, regions. More detail on that?
So I guess success rates would be dependent on the regions and the resources.
Okay, regions, resources.
How much that, I guess the emergency center, how much with their area coverage.
Okay. So all these jurisdictions are going to be different in one way or the other. So we got to account for that.
So would you want to narrow it down to like a specific metropolitan area? I mean, like in the city?
That would be very helpful. Yeah, single city. So what if I was interested in how this problem played out in a rural environment, though? So getting data for a city wouldn't help. So maybe we need an even narrower problem, or we need a narrower definition of what we're looking at, or we're actually trying to solve multiple problems at once. How about training of responders? Would that be an issue? Certification? Oh, okay. So that could be different everywhere you went, right? Depending on the requirements of the jurisdiction. Okay, how about on the effects of stroke? What kind of studies would you look for there? We know that time is an issue.
Many people actually survive.
Okay, so does it actually help?
It would help determine how effective the 911 response time is.
Okay,
Maybe because you don't know what kind of stroke they're having too.
yeah, okay. Is there more than one kind of stroke?
Right, that's
Oh, okay. So definition of stroke. That's good. And yeah, we throw the word stroke around like we know what it means. Maybe we do and maybe we don't. Maybe in the medical world there's 50 different kinds of stroke. We've got to be very clear about what we're talking about. If we find studies on heat stroke, but we're more interested in the stroke that elderly people get. It's a different matter. What was the other one you said? The first one? Oh, the time, right?
I think I said this, the survival rate of people who caught a stroke.
Okay, so how does that relate to 911 then?
If the response time was good, maybe the
Okay.
survivability was a whole lot better.
So is it even in the realm of possibility that this would work? Right. So survivability. I'm sure I spelled that wrong. Okay. Okay, I think we covered some good stuff there on scope. How about content? As opposed to defining the edges of the problem, what would be the substance of the information you would find? Actual data, okay. For stroke? Yeah, okay. Okay, actual data. What does it show? And actually, I think we want them for both, right? How long does a stroke take to play out? How long does it take to 911 to address a problem? So we want to see the overlap there. Okay.
You might actually want to define what you mean, kind of more content. What do you mean by response time? Is that from the time the call is received?
Uh-huh.
Paramedics get there, or when they get to the hospital, or what do you mean?
Before an actual doctor is introduced, yeah, maybe, yeah. Okay. Yeah, we need a definition of response time. That's a good one. Okay. We want to have a medical understanding of the problem too. Okay, I think, that's pretty good. I have some sample ones that I put down there. The date of the studies for the scope of the problem, technology's changing, the way these systems work changes all the time. Study done 25 years ago, it might have good methodology, it might have good data, but is it relevant to the same situation today, right? So that's a limitation. The state of technology, what if that 25-year-old study was pre-cell phone communication days? Does that invalidate the data for today? Vicinity, we covered that one, rural versus metropolitan training, we covered that. What about alternatives? If you live out in the country, would it be better to just put the person in the car and drive to the hospital? Would that be a better solution than calling 911? Something we might want to look at. Definition, studies that track time, benefits of early treatment, okay. Equipment required to address the problem. Studies that covered any of this. So what we really have is an n-dimensional problem. Time is important, equipment is important, the type of problem we're solving. So you think of all the different ways you can bound this one problem. And we're looking for a thesis topic that is not already addressed and answered adequately for today. Any questions on that? Okay. Okay, so let's look at what is a lit review. High-level synthesis and evaluation of the literature in a field or topic. So we've come up with a good research question. We've defined a subfield. The literature we're talking about is any literature and all the literature which helps answer that question. And we want to make a high-level evaluation of that. Think of nonfiction writing, speaking as an expert. We want to know all that material, and we want to tell the reader, this is the state of the art in this little subfield. That sounds like a big ask, and it is if you don't narrow the question. If you narrow the question, you can become the expert in the literature that answers that question. So limited in scope, relevant to the research question. The literature itself is important. We're going to be talking about the literature in the review. It's not like the rest of the thesis where we're, hiding stuff in a footnote. We care who said things, important things. We care when they said it, where they said it. Often naming our sources. We're trying to fit that subfield into the broader dimensions of the field. So we might talk about the main ideas in the field, how does it relate? Schools of thought, do experts disagree as to what are proper methodologies or theories in the field? If we're taking a stand, we need to document how. Are there important documents that are important for our question? Basic definitions like stroke, what's it mean? And then if we're going in a continuum of a field that's changing, we want to tell the reader about that. And we're trying to be very focused, not exhaustive. We're not going to write an encyclopedia on what's on that subfield. We want a very high-level analysis, speaking as someone who's mastered the field. And you can think of any topic. You could write 100 pages on it, could write 50 pages on it, could write 3 pages on it. You could write a sentence on it. And what happens as you're moving up that triangle, you're dropping out the detail and you're characterizing it. So it's a different kind of truth. Down here, it's the truth of the facts. Here, it's the truth of your evaluation of what the facts add up to. So that's how we get to that condensed, high-level view of the literature. You could read a 1,000-page history of the world and sum it up in one sentence. Well, I'd be interested to see what you came up with, but you could certainly do that. Okay, and up to date. We want things to be timely. We want things are changing. The underpinnings of our field are changing all the time. Technology is changing. So what's most useful is an up-to-date evaluation of that field. We don't want out-of-date material. And then the bottom line, high-level evaluation of what we know today. Okay, what is it not? We kind of got into this with the glass of clear liquid example. Literature review is not background material. We're not summarizing the findings of all these useful documents. We're looking at their scope. We're looking at their limitations. Okay, we're not merely summarizing. We're not being exhaustive in summarizing. Not going to merely list the sources or do an annotated bibliography, which is a list of books with descriptions of each. In research, you go down a lot of blind alleys. That's just part of the business. We don't want to know about that. The stuff you read that doesn't end up being helpful, don't need to put that in unless there's something specially important about that. And then it's not a forum for new research, because that's what your thesis is. So in the literature review, we might say what the purpose of our research is to give shape to that literature review, but our findings, all the new stuff that we do, that goes everywhere else in the thesis. And not mere opinion either. We want expert opinion from someone who's mastered the topic. Okay, there are 3 main types of lit reviews. The good news is you only have to do 2 of them. The first one, the one you won't have to do most likely, is a standalone lit review. So you can imagine you're a biologist, you've been reading academic articles that analyze how hummingbirds fly, and you go, well, there's quite a few of these, but I don't see anything that sums up what all this stuff adds up to. What does it all mean? What do we know about hummingbird flight today? So you write a lit review, you evaluate all that material, you pull all the ideas together, say what we know, what we don't know. Something like that would be it'd be fun to do as a thesis. If you can find a lit review like that that's relevant to the topic of your thesis, you're a very lucky person, because that's a great entree into that field. The ones you will be doing is for your thesis proposal. You'll still be in that calibration phase. Maybe you won't have nailed down your question yet. You're still kind of figuring things out. You write a mini lit review with the expectation that it could change as you finalize your actual thesis. And then in your actual thesis, it'll be refined, focused, thorough, the final thing, complete as you can make it. Okay, master's thesis versus PhD dissertation. Here at NPS, if you're doing a dissertation, which I gather nobody is, you're really working more with the theoretical foundations of your field, the basic methodologies, the fundamental ideas. You're attacking those and extending them. For a master's thesis, you're not expected to come up with new theories or upset existing theories. You're more likely to be taking existing theories, applying them to a real-world problem in a way that hasn't been done before. So, say, for example, there was a well-known theory about why dictators overtake certain countries, but no one had ever applied the dictator theory to a certain tribe of Amazon Indians which had a dictator. You do that, then you're applying the theory to a new real-world problem. And what do you come up with? Does the dictator theory hold water in that context? Or does that experience make us want to question the dictator theory? Okay. Similarities between the master's and the PhD. Evaluate the literary foundation for the research, being as thorough as possible. We want to fit it into the broader context of the field. And then here, this is a very important idea. In a thesis or a dissertation, you're expected to do something that's new. We're not simply moving information from one place to another or from 6 places into one place. We're looking for evidence, we're analyzing it, and we're answering a research question that has not been asked elsewhere. And so what you do in the literature review, by bounding off this problem, by showing the limitations of that existing subfield, you're justifying your thesis by proving that you're doing something that hasn't been done before. So you don't get to say, I'm doing something new, thank you for taking my word for it. You actually have to prove it. And the lit review is where you prove it. And you get to speak in it as an expert. No one's going to go check all your sources and see whether you describe them accurately. But you want to, master that knowledge of that subfield and then just describe it as a high level. And this will make more sense when we take a look at our example. Okay, differences. Masters is obviously going to be narrower. That's good news. We get asked about length. How long should it be? Really, theoretically, there's no limit. If your research question defines a subfield which has 2,000 articles and 500 books that address that question, you get to read them all and evaluate them. But if you were to find out that that was the case, that would be a very strong clue that your research question was too broad or that someone else had gotten there first. So if you have too much material, narrow the question down. So master's thesis, around 3 to 5 pages. That doesn't sound like a lot, but because we're evaluating things at a very high level, you don't need a lot of space. Think of it in terms of sound bites. If you go on Ellen to talk about your new book, she gives you 2 sentences to describe the book and convince the audience that they should go buy it. That's the kind of writing you're doing in the lit review. Really compressed, really high level. Pithy. You can have a question so narrow that maybe you find 2 articles and half a dozen previous NPS theses on the topic. Maybe it's on virtual reality, applications of virtual reality work. We do a lot here at NPS, but is not done that many places elsewhere. It could be very brief to say that this question has not been answered. This question 1 has been answered, question 2 has been answered, question 3 has been answered. They all touch on my topic, but no one has addressed my topic specifically. So it can be really short. There's no length requirement. It's just whatever it takes to sum up that subfield succinctly. And this is the sample, and it's only 2 pages. And if you thought of this in 12-point type in the thesis template, this might be 3 to 5 pages. So we'll see how that plays out. And it's a social sciences example too. Okay, role of the advisor. This is the wild card. Because your advisor may have their own idea as to what you should do in a lit review. The advisor may say, I don't want to see another lit review on where the dictator theory came from. Restrict your analysis to tribes in the Amazon jungle. So that's okay. I mean, they're the ones that are signing off. They know what they want. So you have to communicate well with your advisor to figure out what's going on there. They can provide names of key works and authors, get you started, examples of well-crafted literature reviews, maybe in former NPS theses, for example, give you feedback. And also the Writing Center coaches, they can work with you on your lit review at any phase, from starting off to, how does the finished lit review work? So that's a good resource, especially if your advisor's out of town for a few weeks. All right. So, critical nature of the lit review, we're not simply summarizing information. We're trying to evaluate it at a high level. So these are the skills we need to have. You need to be extremely inquisitive, constantly pushing your mind into new directions, asking questions about the literature you're looking at. Because sometimes what you see on the page is so well crafted by that author, you think they've said it all. But sometimes you want to look at what's not being said, what's not on the page, what is being overlooked. You need to be relentless, to be thorough, have a gnawing fear that you're overlooking something. It helps to have a research question that really interests you, that is in your field, that you think is worthwhile, something that will grab your attention and hold you for 6 months. If it's something you don't really care for, it's really hard to get into it to the degree you need to. And then skepticism. Find evidence for answering a research question. Not all evidence is created equal. Some evidence is great, some evidence is poor. We constantly need to be evaluating things, holding evidence to the highest standard of truth. We want to write the thesis with the best evidence that will make the most convincing argument for your thesis question. Okay. All right, now we'll do another interactive element, and thinking of all of the different ways we can attack some literature for its weaknesses. So, potential weaknesses. I'll throw out a couple of softballs. Out-of-date literature. Fantastic literature, profound literature, 30 years out of date. Sorry. Can't use it. Maybe we can use it if nothing's changed. If things have changed, we can't use it. How about lack of consensus among experts? Okay. So you read one article, the expert in your field says one thing. You read another article, the expert says another, and you're thinking, do these people talk to each other? Are they reading each other's stuff? Because they don't seem to be on the same page. Well, that's a weakness in the field, because who are you going to believe? So if they're talking about things that are really germane to your research area, you've got to make that evaluation. You've got to make that call. You've got to figure out who's telling the truth, or maybe you downgrade that issue as to a controversy that you're not going to be able to resolve. What about other things? Anyone think of other weaknesses we might find in literature? Bias. That's a great one. Are there different kinds of bias? Like what? Anything come to mind? Political bias, okay. marketing as in a commercial enterprise is presenting an argument, yeah. And we get this in the social sciences, right? You probably wouldn't read a lot of math articles with bias in them.
Maybe institutional.
Institutional?
Sure.
Like what kind of institution?
Institutions used to doing something a certain way, so they think that's the best.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's a good one. Institutional bias. Okay, other things. How about overly optimistic assumptions? No one would ever do that, right? That's just like unthinkable. Why would anyone ever do that? That gets a little at political bias too, right? What's the old saying? If only we had some ham, we could have ham and eggs. If only we had some eggs. That goes back to the Depression. overly optimistic assumptions, right? Anything else come to mind? I think we've got a good starter set. I've been compiling a list over time. People keep adding new ones for me. Getting into biases, that's my favorite list. Methodological bias. Our field tells us that this is the reliable method for solving a problem, so we use that method over and over. What if that method is wrong? Paradigm bias. Perhaps we see that something happened in one situation, so we apply it to all situations. Discipline bias. Our field tells us that this is the truth, this is how things are should be done. What if scholars are wrong? This is my favorite. Anyone heard of the Stockholm Syndrome? That is if you're kidnapped and you take on the interests, you start to sympathize with your kidnapper. That actually happens. In this context, the kidnapper is your advisor, and you are the kidnapped victim. And if your advisor thinks X, Y, and Z is the truth, that is probably going to have to be reflected in your thesis. So I hope you never get painted into a corner where you don't want to be, but, things happen. It's not likely, I don't think. But I would say if you did come up with that situation, argue your way out of it as best you can. Lack of a theoretical framework. Our field tells us that these are the sound theories for analyzing problems. These theories have been developed over years and years and years. Many scholars attacking these theories over and over. So as time goes by, theories of how the world works get better. What if we don't have that in some of the literature we read? Not relying upon the developed wisdom of our field. That's a red flag. What if theory says that one thing should be true, but the facts show something else? It's something we need to work out. And then just gaps. Knowledge is infinite. Realistically, the amount of things that scholars have examined and the questions they've answered is a small set compared to all the potential questions. So there are many, many gaps, things that have just never been answered because no one's gotten around to it. There aren't enough scholars in that field. There isn't enough time. That's an opportunity. Brand new field, so not enough work has been done. Great opportunity for doing thesis work. knowledge that is wrong, contradictory, statistically insufficient. You'll see studies that say, well, we've shown that this is true, but we used a sample size of 10. We recommend that a full study be done with 10,000 subjects, right? So how much do you trust the study that was based on 10 subjects? Okay, so the strengths are really the opposite of that list. Valid theoretical framework, agreement among experts, theory and facts agree, knowledge that's current, consistent, sufficient, coherent, valid, unbiased, etc., etc. Not all of this stuff gets applied to every literature review. This is just the kind of way you want to be thinking. When you go through literature, you want to be asking these kind of questions all the time. What's missing, what's wrong, what's incomplete, and where you find the answer, and if you only have to find that answer in one situation, that's an opportunity to do something new in your thesis. And then at the end, make an argument in support of that. No, I think you should account for that in some way. If those experts are particularly relevant to your topic, then you have to kind of confront that, admit they disagree, and either take a position for good reasons or leave that as an open question. Just full disclosure to the reader. You know, everything that's right or wrong with what we're doing, we want the reader to know about.
No question. So
Yeah.
And one of the examples here on the top right of this page said that researchers disagree on prevalence, and then gives 5 footnotes without explaining them. Is that an appropriate way to proceed with that information?
Yeah, I was going to bring up that sentence. What's your name? Aaron. Aaron was pointing to a sentence in the example that says, researchers have found that approximately 21% of college students have been stalked. And then the footnote citation, this is in the very first paragraph after the little stalking vignette. And then the footnotes are 1 to 6. So we can see what those items are on the backside. The journal, like number 5, the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. Who knew there was a magazine with that name, right? So that they're not saying why or how they got that one number, but they read that material and they're saying they're presenting a consensus, I think. And I think if in those 6 articles the numbers were wildly divergent, they wouldn't have written it that way. But they probably found a rough consensus, and so that's what they're presenting. So that's an example of a high-level evaluation. They've read all that material, they're summarizing it for the reader. No, in the lit review you don't. If, say those 6 articles had a lot of data that was important, you might want to talk about that elsewhere in a background chapter or other parts of the thesis. Yeah. Although I've found that you say you've got a research question, you're all ready to go out and find articles that answer the question. You find all these articles and you look into them, and the authors, 9 times out of 10, they're actually talking about something else. They don't care about what we're doing. They cared about what they were doing. So you find parts of their articles that are useful to you. Sometimes a paragraph or a sentence maybe. So that's part of the game also. Okay, so organization in writing, take notes, don't rely on your memory. tag quotes so that you don't 6 months later take a note that you made out of a book that's actually an exact quote and put it in your thesis. That's considered plagiarism. Keywords and phrases, if there are ideas you need to search on, as you get a lot of notes, put in text searchable items, make them consistent so you can do one search and find everything. Then the lit review is going to be organized by theme, if it's big enough. Basic definitions, main ideas, the different areas that were pulled into the research. Maybe in the 911 example, we have a section on 911 studies, another section on studies of the problems of stroke. Okay, we want some structure to the lit review. Like in everything in academic writing, we're always pushing the context up front because knowledge can go in every direction. So we always want the reader to know where we're heading with the details. So give a complete scope, describe the structure if you have multiple sections or parts, and then possibly a thesis statement. So going back to our previous example, the efficiency of the 911 system has been studied on numerous occasions, as has the need for early treatment of stroke victims, but there has been no recent effort to connect these two problem domains. Okay, so anything is out of date, so we need a new study that looks as to how these problems are connected. Organization by theme, section headings if you need them. You can put, if you're getting data out of your literature, you can put it in a table, you know, where one column of the table are the article names. And then I tend to think if you've got a short lit review or a short academic paper of any kind, that really takes off the pressure for having a conclusion because you already gave the complete overview up here. But you can, the longer it is, you might need a conclusion to remind the reader where we've been, what we've come up with, and then sometimes to fit it in to the new research you're doing. This study will show that early intervention facilitated by the 911 system can play a significant role in minimizing the long-term damages from stroke. Okay, this is what this is what our research told us, so we don't have to keep the reader in suspense. Okay, so now let's get into the example. And I introduced this example last quarter, and what I did was I asked everyone to read it, and then I left the room for 10 minutes and came back and we discussed it. And it didn't really work out that well because I think it was too much to lay a bunch of theoretical ideas and then say, hunt down the examples in the article. So I think what makes more sense, and we'll try this here, is that we'll just walk through this article and we'll examine each of the parts as we get to them. Anyone think this is a long document? No, this fits our definition of short and high level. So don't be afraid to keep it brief. Okay, we don't want to get sidetracked on the content. Whether you've been a stalker, a victim of stalking, you think the problem is under-addressed in society or overblown or all those issues, let's not get sidetracked on that. We want to look at lit review elements. We want to look for things that mark out the boundaries of the problem and justify the research that this is set up to do. So we'll look for the organization and other key lit review elements. So we want to see if the thing is organized by theme. We want examples of high-level writing. We got one of those already. Is there a research question in there or a thesis? Are we addressing gaps? Are we criticizing and evaluating the literature that helps answer this question? Do we get into definitions? Does this fit into the broader context of the field? Things that define boundaries, is it up to date? And are we justifying the work? And just so you don't have to take notes, the next screen, I actually list out, paragraph by paragraph, what the organization of the thing is. And then on the one after that, I identify different elements and where they show up. So the slides are on the Writing Center website, and I'll give you a link for that later. So you don't really need to make detailed notes there. So has anyone taken Professor Shore's Reading with Intent course? Nobody? Okay. Well, he teaches how to read any academic article and extract the thesis quickly. And we'll, in brief, apply his method to this article. And his first step is to look at all titles and headings and really consider what they're saying. And then his second step is to jump to the conclusion, because in his view, the conclusion is more likely to be the place where you get the best statement of the author's thesis. And that happens to be the case with this article too. We have one little section. So let's jump right to the title then to start with. The prevalence of stalking among college students. Now, thinking of the literature review as something that defines the boundaries of a problem, what do you see in this title that's setting the boundaries? College students, right? We're not talking about the public, not talking about people in other countries. We're not talking about high school kids, college students. Okay. What else? Stalking. So what is stalking? Do we need a definition for that, or does everyone know exactly what that is? Or are there different kinds of stalking? We've probably all been in the situation where you're walking down a street at night and you hear footsteps. Is that person following me? I've been on the flip side too, where you turn onto a street and someone up there hears you and you can tell they're freaked out by your being there, right? That's not the kind of stalking we're talking about. Okay, anything else? One last element. Prevalence. What is prevalence? How much? Frequency. So we're looking at rates. We're not looking at how stalkers stalk. We're not going in depth into the effect it would have on victims. We're looking at prevalence rates of this problem among college students, period. Okay, so we got a pretty good idea of what's going on here. We expect to see some numbers, some statistics. So now let's skip ahead to the conclusion and the present study. A first step in implementing a social norms framework is to determine rates of stalking, thus establishing a need to reform a culture of violence if one exists. So what do we get out of that statement? Anything spring to mind? A culture of violence if one exists. Are we even conceding there's a problem? Maybe there is and maybe there isn't, right? We want to find out the data. We want to find out, we don't want to say it's a big problem or a small problem. We find out the number, we know exactly how big it is. Social norms framework. That sounds a lot like, okay, we're putting it into the broader context. What is a social norms framework? I don't know, maybe we'll find out here. And then what's the problem? If this culture of violence exists, we're going to reform it, or we need to reform it. The purpose of this study was threefold. Love sentences like that. The purpose of this study, those are the sentences you want to zero in on, was threefold, three purposes. First, we updated prevalence rates using self-identification, the respondent's own definition, and behavioral measures, researcher definition. Okay, so we already know we have competing definitions. The definition of the person you ask and the definition of the person asking the question of stalking victimizations. Okay. Second, we assessed whether students who affirm they have experienced stalking behaviors then label such behaviors as stalking. So that's an issue there. Is there a difference between what we define as stalking and what people who have been stalked will actually call stalking? You know, if there is a difference, maybe that's going to affect the data. Finally, the third item, we analyzed the demographic and behavioral factors that might predict stalking victimization, okay? The findings from this research allow us to demonstrate the extent stalking is a problem for college students, to compare this sample to national prevalence rates, and to educate personnel in higher education on how to recognize and prioritize prevention and education issues for the campus community. Okay, so what are we getting a difference in there in that statement? What are we comparing?
Sample to higher level studies.
Okay, and what is the sample from? College students to national prevalence rates. Okay, so there's a prevalence rate for the whole country, everyone thrown into one giant category, and we're going to look at it just for colleges. So what if those numbers are exactly the same?
They say that, close book.
Huh?
They say that that's the case and close the book.
Yeah, you say, okay, say they're the same, I'm done. Okay, maybe it's not a college problem then. Maybe it's an everywhere problem, and college officials shouldn't be required to do something different because it's handled globally, right? What if it's a lot higher? Maybe colleges need to add their own level of policing to the problem. You know, what if it's lower? We don't need to think about it at all. Okay, so there's a lot of F's there. We're not even saying there's a problem. We're saying we need to find these prevalence rates to find out if there is a problem. Okay. Getting back to the beginning, they start with a little example of what stalking is. I think we probably already kind of know what that is. A female student is being pestered by a male student. She's telling him to leave him alone, but he doesn't. So now she's thinking, well, should I stop going to class to avoid him? Okay, so now we know the kind of problem we're talking about. The aforementioned vignette is representative of early stalking encounters that students experience on college campuses. Getting back to your sentence, researchers have found that approximately 21% of college students have been stalked. So if that's the truth, is 21% something that should be addressed? Is that too low, too high? You know, maybe that's a policy question. Further, data from a national sample indicates that 74 victims of stalking victims were between 18 and 39 years of age. If we have a study that's victims between 18 and 39, and 92% of our sample pool is between 18 and 22. That study might not be useful for what we're doing, right? Too broad. Okay, maybe we need to subdivide the problem. What if we get data that mixes males and females into one pool? Is that helpful? Not if the prevalence rates differ between the two groups. Okay, so forth and so on. So we're looking at the limitations of the existing data. Okay, the next paragraph talks about stalking victims can be negatively affected. It cites a number of studies that show what the harmful effects can be. So that's all in one paragraph. That's sort of describing the necessity of the research, not necessarily the boundaries of it. Looking at the third paragraph that starts on line 57. Okay, although previous research demonstrates that stalking is a significant social concern, prevalence rates vary widely. So is that a problem for us? Got a lot of studies. Some studies for these people, some studies for those people. They all come up with different numbers. We can't just sweep them all into one pool and say that's the answer. We have to account for all these differences. So the authors are continually pointing out problems in the existing data. Okay, according to a meta-analysis, there are several methodological reasons for these inconsistent prevalence rates. One reason for this variability is a lack of consistency in how stalking was measured, all right? For example, some researchers asked if the respondents had been stalked within the last 12 months, and others asked about lifetime prevalence rates. Okay, so there's another difference. You're interviewing your subjects and you're saying anything happened to you in the last year. Another study says anything happened to you in your lifetime. You know, obviously one of those studies not as useful to us. The lifetime rate, because most of our lifetime doesn't involve being in college, although you might think it does while you're here at NPS. Okay, further, how researchers determine whether stalking has taken place varies considerably among studies. Okay, I think I did that one. Others have asked respondents if they had been stalked by an intimate person within the past year, based on the respondent's personal definition. Okay, so there's going to be a difference as to whether the researcher provides the definition of stalking versus whether the subject provides the definition. The subject provides a definition, right? The responses could be all over the map, right? Because we don't always all have the same definition for that term. To our knowledge, only one study addressed the prevalence of stalking during college enrollment. Is that an issue? Right, that's the subject of our study, right? And we can only find one study that ever looked in this. And there's a problem with it. Participants were labeled as stalking victims by the researchers, not by self-identification. Okay, so they think that self-identification is the better method to go. But that's not what they got in that one study. So we keep piling on reason after reason why the existing studies are not valuable to our specific problem. So we got another in paragraph starting on line 71, difference between all women's college versus an all men's college. Okay, starting on line 88. Additionally, most state laws include in their definition of stalking unwanted, repeated, implicit, or explicit threatening behavior or intrusions resulting in psychological distress and reasonable fear. Okay, sounds like good definition. However, legal definitions can vary by state, and interpretations of the reasonable person standard can vary by individual. Yet another problem. States have laws against this behavior, but they all define it in their own way. So we can't take, we'll find out on the next line. Thus, it is difficult to assess how widespread stalking is on campuses due to these measurement, sampling, and legal issues. So we have this big pile of studies. Everyone is doing their own thing. They're using their own methodology. They're addressing different size groups, different demographics of groups. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? You decide you want to do a study. You figure out what you think is valid because you want to answer a specific question. So we go to use their studies. We use them if we can, but if they don't help with our question, then we're out of luck. That's not really anybody's fault. That's just often the way it is. The paragraph starting line 97. In order to effectively determine whether a culture of violence exists, it is important for college campuses to focus on obtaining accurate data about the prevalence of stalking that is part of a larger cycle of interpersonal violence. So what do you get from that? What are we doing with that statement? So we're putting it into a larger context. So presumably there are a lot of people looking at interpersonal violence, but there are many problems that fall into that category. So we're taking our stalking problem and fitting it into that group, which may mean we can rely upon methodologies in that group, thinking that researchers have done on similar problems. Although some college campuses have begun to recognize this problem, the manner in which crime statistics are reported and the way the issue is addressed vary by university. Okay, we're running into another roadblock. We can't just go ask universities for their data because they're all measuring the problem in a different way. We have to account for that. So you keep getting the idea we're moving toward this justification that we need that $100,000 grant so we can go out there with one system of measurement, determine the size of the problem once and for all with all these variables not getting in the way of giving us a good answer. Okay, paragraph starting 114. Prevalence rates suggest that stalking behavior may be perceived as normative in our society according to the social norms theory. Okay, we're drawing on the broader context. We're drawing upon the theories in our field. According to this theory, social norms are accepted, explicit, and implicit rules of behavior that govern how individuals interact with others, okay? Unfortunately, sometimes perceived social norms are incorrect. In fact, many people may not endorse a particular social norm, yet because they believe others approve of that norm, they continue to tolerate it. Previous research demonstrates that using a social norms approach can be an effective framework for addressing interpersonal violence, such as stalking. So we're drawing on the theories of our field. How do we use existing theories to address our problem? And you kind of get a sense. And you remember from that conclusion, Okay, the purposes of the study. A first step in implementing a social norms framework is to determine rates of stalking, thus establishing a need to reform culture of violence, so forth and so on. Okay, so did we see organization by theme? Yeah, we started out with a little example, then we moved into a bunch of statistics, then we went on to negative effects of stalking, then we started talking about the limitations of previous research, so forth. At the end, we start to get into what theories may be applicable to this problem. So this is an argument. It's building up. It's a high-level evaluation of the existing data put in the form of an argument that's ultimately going to justify the research we're proposing. So is it high-level writing? Yeah, because we know there's 18 articles here. If each one was 10 pages, which is optimistic, that'd be 180 pages, right? We've got 2. So we know the knowledge there is really boiled down. Do we know the research question? We identified that. Okay, gaps in the literature. Did we see those? Yeah. We found one study on prevalence rates in college, but it had a defect according to the way we look at things. So that one study, not that helpful. So yeah, we got a huge gap. No one has ever looked at colleges as a whole using what we consider a reliable methodology. So that's our opportunity to write an article or a paper. Are we criticizing the data? We're not calling it good or bad. We're evaluating it in terms of how it helps our research question. Great studies, but they don't cover the thing we want to study. Maybe half of them do, maybe partially, maybe we can get some use out of them. Definitions, did we get those? What did we get defined? What is stalking? Okay, social norms theory, that get defined? Yeah, in the very last paragraph before the conclusion. Okay, broader context, did we attempt to fit it into our field? We talked about the culture of violence, which is a larger problem of which this stalking is a subset. So we're fitting it into the larger field. Why? Because that taps us into larger methodology, larger theoretical framework that we can use to solve our problem. Boundary definitions. See stuff like that. You know, lots of stuff like that. 18 to 39-year-olds, those have boundaries that may not be useful to us. Studies which use a researcher-based definition versus studies that use a subject-based definition. That's a clear boundary between the two. We don't expect necessarily for them to come up with the same results, and our writers clearly think that the subject-based definition is better. How about timeliness? Any sense whether this is up to date? Okay, I'll tell you, this is from a book that we have out in the Writing Center stacks by Galvin. I put his name at the top. Writing Literature Reviews, a Guide for Students of the Social and Behavioral Sciences. And all the material on lit reviews is aimed at the social sciences. That's just because the topic as a topic unto itself is relatively new. You could, waiting for someone to write a book on lit reviews for math, lit reviews for engineering. The principles are the same, but the application might be a little different. Okay, that book was published in 2013. As we go down through the list of references at the end, 2007, 1997, 2008. What's the most recent date in there? I see a 2010. See another 2010. Anything more recent than that? 2003, 2008, 1998. So what's the oldest one anyone sees in there? 97. And the newest one? 2010. Okay, so that gives me a warm fuzzy, right? So we seem to be working with a fairly recent window. We're not calling upon studies that were done in the 50s when methodologies were probably cruder, fields were less developed. Is it up to date though? Well, we know this sample book was, or the lit review book was published in 2013. So you figure if something was published in 2010, then it was probably written in 2012. Oh, okay. So 2012. Okay, great. Yeah. So this lit review 2012. Okay. So it was probably written in 2010, because the way you get something published, you send it to a journal. The editor farms it out to 3 experts in the field. That's what peer review is. The experts are all curmudgeons, so they tell you one tells you you have to change this part, the other says you need to change that part. So you do all that to make them happy. Of course, that all takes 6 months because one of the experts is on sabbatical, et cetera, et cetera. So you send in an article, a year and a half, it finally ends up in print. So if we have a 2012 article and sources from 2010, yeah, they probably went for the most up-to-date stuff they can get. But it's not like everything's from 2010, right? Because there probably aren't a dozen studies in this area done every year. You know, it's 18 studies done over 10 years. Okay, we ran over time. So there's a bibliography and some resources. That's on the website. The slides are here. If there are things with the workshop that didn't work that well for you, by all means, write them on your survey sheets because we're trying to improve these all the time. Any questions? Everyone ready to write a lit review? Did I make it sound impossible? The key, narrow down that research question. If you don't, you will make it impossible.